At odds over Syria. But do either the United States or Russia have a viable plan to end the conflict that's left thousands dead over the last 15 months? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The US Secretary of State is standing by accusations that Russia is supplying President Bashar al-Assad's government with attack helicopters. Russia's foreign minister says that his country is not providing Syria with anything that could be used against peaceful demonstrators. And it turns out that Clinton was not referring to new shipments by the Russians. A senior Defense Department official told the New York Times that the Secretary of State was, quote, putting a spin on it to put the Russians in a difficult position, end quote. In Syria itself, the United Nations peacekeeping chief says the conflict has escalated into a civil war. A peace plan brokered by former UN Chief Kofi Annan has all but failed, despite having the nominal support of all parties, including the US and Russia. Those two powers, however, differ on Syria's future. The US has repeatedly called on Assad to step down and wants the international community to unite with one voice calling for regime change. Russia agrees with the UN envoy that a regional grouping should be formed to put pressure on all sides of the conflict to stop the violence. As part of that, Iran, which retains influence over Assad's regime, would be involved, something the US finds unacceptable. Russian leaders have rejected international military intervention, and despite increasingly bellicose language, the US and its European allies aren't keen on that idea either. As for the Syrian opposition, some question whether the strong words from Washington and Moscow have anything to do with their struggle for democracy.
What Ms. Clinton stated yesterday, it's not new to us. Russia has been providing all kind of military equipment to the Syrian regime. This is not yesterday, this is not last year, this has been going on for years and years. So this is nothing new to us. I think that her reaction yesterday is totally political.
So, do either the US or Russia have a plan that would actually improve the situation in Syria? And how are each country's regional interests influencing their positions? To discuss this, we're joined from the US state of Oklahoma by Joshua Landis. He's the Director for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Here in the studio, we have Michele Dunne. She's a former specialist on Middle East affairs to the White House, as well as James Jatras. He's a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. Michele Dunne, in some ways, Hillary Clinton's comments about helicopters and the rather embarrassing climb down that we've been seeing, I mean, is that rather symbolic of the US position that we've been seeing?
Well, we have seen repeated attempts by the United States to escalate the pressure against Syria, and then somewhat the United States backing off. We've got a situation where we have an American leadership that's eager to be less involved in the Middle East, and yet there is this terrible situation in Syria. They don't at all want to use military force, and yet they also feel there are critical interests at stake and an escalating humanitarian disaster in Syria that they can't ignore. And I think what we saw here was Secretary Clinton sort of responding to this pressure and trying to turn the pressure onto the Russians.
But arguably rather ineptly. I mean, one wonders whether, I mean, this is clearly an immensely complicated situation, but they don't really know what to do about it. So all they do is they cling on to the central tenets of Obama foreign policy, which is, well, at least we know one thing, and that's that Russia and Iran are negative actors in the region. But that's all they have, really.
Well, I mean, the critical tenet of Obama foreign policy is multilateralism, and the United States is not going to act alone, and we're going to act within a framework of international legitimacy and so forth. And so that's one of the reasons why their hands are tied, because they haven't found a way to get around a Russian veto on the Security Council for further action. Not that they're eager, by the way, for military action against Syria. I think they really don't want to do that, or at a minimum would like to put it off until after the U.S. presidential election.
Joshua Landis, I mean, that's quite interesting. I mean, that suggests that this administration can only think in terms of these Security Council resolutions, perhaps Chapter 7 for intervention of some sort or another, when there are other plans on the table, this idea of a contact group which would involve regional actors, there seems to be this impossibility perhaps to be able to even consider that because they're so stuck in various grooves as they are.
Well, they are. And Obama has defined his foreign policy by multilateralism, as we just heard. He does not want to be Bush. People are pushing him to be President Bush, which is to go in alone, to ignore the UN, ignore the Russians and Chinese, and to take responsibility for Syria. The Turks have said, we're not going to go in without you going first. The Saudis have said the same thing. The entire world has shied away from taking leadership on Syria. They want America to do what they did in Iraq or Afghanistan. And Obama has said, we're exhausted. We've spent too much money. I'm getting out of the Middle East. And this is not what America needs to do, which is just to waltz into these ancient ethnic problems and problems of national identity and try to build a nation state in Syria, which is a potential quagmire that he does not want to get into, and most Americans don't want to get into.
Right, but if there is a potential way out, which is to have a contact group involving everyone, then why are they unable then to say yes to that? Do they really think that the way to conflict resolution is simply to talk to those people you agree with?
Well, I think you're right. There is a bigger proxy war going on here that reflects back to the Cold War. And, you know, at the end of the Second World War, America and the West had destroyed Hitler because they could deny him oil and energy for his aircraft, his Air Force, and his tanks. In planning for Third World War, the United States has always thought about the Gulf region, the Persian Gulf, as the stranglehold over world energy. And that is just as true today as it was before. And China and Russia both see Iran as the real white elephant in this. Syria, in a sense, is where they've drawn the line. Syria is allied with Iran. And if Syria goes, then Iran is going to be next. And America's policy is to overthrow the regime in Iran and regime change in Iran. And if Syria goes, you know, the reason that most people in Washington want to take on Syria is they see it as a way to hurt Iran and to fulfill U.S. objectives in Iran. And so, in that sense, Russia and China both put on their foot on the brakes here, and they said, no, Syria isn't going down. And that leaves Syria stuck in this much broader proxy war that is about control over energy. And after all, China gets 20% of its imported energy comes from Iran. It does not want to see Iran fall.
But then, I mean, that's what's so confusing, James Jatras. So on the one hand, Joshua Landis there says, look, they don't want to get involved. They realize the complexities. On the other hand, they do want to get involved because they realize how useful this is in the proxy war against Iran. Perhaps that is reflected in some of the rather confusing messages we're getting from the Secretary of State and others.
I think there's some truth to that, and I think this is part of the problem on the Russian side, is that, maybe broaden the perspective here in terms of Russia's standing in the world and our standing in the world. I think they felt they were ill-used in Libya on the resolution concerning Libya. They remember with great pain the way they were treated over Kosovo, not only the war in 1999, but the Declaration of Independence in 2008. The notion that we have developed, and we the Americans in the post-Cold War period have developed that, well, when there's a difference of opinion internationally, we're right and they're wrong. And if the Russians disagree with us in the Security Council, we call them disgusting, we call them sickening. We use these are not the words in which you discuss differences of opinion with another major power whose veto in the Security Council is worth every bit as much, if we have any system of law in the world, as the American veto is. We don't respect that. I think part of what is here as well is that I think there's some people in this administration, certainly some people in Congress, who are far more eager than I think Mr. Obama is personally to have a military solution to the Syrian crisis. Let's face it, it is a civil war now. The Russians are supporting the government. We're supporting some the opposition forces, some of whom, according to our established pattern in the last few words, are some very nasty fellows. Why is it we always seem to find ourselves allied with democratic forces that include some jihadist elements, and that I found very disturbing. I know there's some concerns in Russia about, for example, the fate of Christians in Syria if this goes forward. We throw these things out the window because we're so used to being able to define the morality of international conflicts, and if you don't agree with us, you're wrong, we'll just go around you.
Okay, we want to explore some of the themes that both you and Joshua have brought up, but very quickly on this idea of the contact group, as a Russia specialist, is there any evidence that Russia and Iran for that matter, would use their influence constructively for conflict resolution if this contact group was convened with them aboard, or would they also simply be pushing their own strategic interests? I mean, is anyone actually, let's face it, anyone interested in democracy in Syria in the first place?
I mean, democracy in Syria. I mean, like our Saudi friends interested in democracy in Syria. Come on now.
But would they be working? Would they be working honestly? I mean, you said that the U.S. We've established that the U.S. basically has a lot of conflicting interests. What about Russia?
I think they want to see the regime to be preserved. I think that they would like to see some way that there could be a negotiation that would end this war. I don't know what that would look like. I'm not sure they know what it would look like. I think that that's part of the problem we find ourselves in here. They're proposing a solution that is very iffy at best. We're proposing a solution that can only have one outcome, which is pouring more gasoline on the fire and ultimately bringing the regime down to get to the path that Joshua pointed out, which is a blow at what I think is the true objective for many people here in Washington, which is Iran.
All right, so Michele Dunne, I mean, would you agree then, we can be clear, that none of these actors who are involved in the discussion about Syria, the US, Russia, China, the Gulf countries, are interested in a representative democracy really in Syria? This isn't really what they're talking about. They are talking about their own strategic interests. We should forget about the opposition's hopes and dreams for their country when we're talking about the great game that's currently underway, correct?
Well, I don't completely agree with that. I mean, of course, let's not be naive. When countries get involved in the affairs of other countries, they always have their own interests in mind, and of course we have to remember that. But we also have to remember, I feel like in the few minutes we've spent on this so far, we're losing track of the fact that civilians are being massacred in Syria by their government. And I do think that the United States feels the heat of that it's not only that the United States wants to strike a blow at Iran, and that's why it is saying that the government of Bashar al-Assad could go. I mean, if you look at the report that Amnesty International just put out about Syria, it's horrific, and they're talking about systematic
right, but the problem with that is the US is always very selective as to who it judges on these sorts of Amnesty International report, I'm afraid. I mean, there is that sense that specifically after the last 20 years, perhaps, of foreign policy, no one believes these humanitarian concerns
But this is
anymore.
on a scale, this is becoming to be on a large scale, okay? And in previous examples of this, be it Kosovo, be it Rwanda, there builds a sense of outrage in the international community, in the United States,
but in Kosovo, it chimed with a wish to get rid of Slobodan Milosevic, for example. So there were wider.
There's always more than one thing going on at a time, for sure. Now, also on the issue of democratic government, I will say this. I mean, I think that when the United States gets involved in the affairs of another country and aids somehow in regime change, whether it's in Iraq or elsewhere, it feels under some obligation to promote democratic government as what comes next. That doesn't mean the United States is always successful at this or whatever, but I do think that the United States would promote a democratic government in Syria if Bashar al-Assad were to go.
And that's a fascinating concept. Joshua Landis, I mean, isn't this part of the reason why there is a rather confused reaction? They don't understand
No.
Does the US necessarily... Okay, well, actually, let's unpick some of those statements. What role does the wish for democracy and the wish to prevent humanitarian disaster have in the US's foreign policy decision-making on Syria right now?
Well, the trouble here is, as we progress down this road to civil war, the questions of democracy are becoming less and less apparent. The trouble is that it's going to have to be the Syrians that bring democracy to Syria. We've seen in Iraq, we've seen in Afghanistan or Libya that America cannot produce democracy for anybody. And they're going to have to produce it for themselves. And unfortunately, the Syrian opposition have been divided, fragmented, and have really lost their equilibrium here. We're going to see an increasingly militarized opposition, and the military leaders are going to take over. And whether they're going to be Democrats or not Democrats is anybody's guess. The Democrats are getting pushed to the side, and we've seen the Syrian National Council, that was the umbrella group, many very educated people who talked about democracy most of the time have now almost become irrelevant. They've just elected a new president, a Kurdish fellow that everybody's been attacking from within the Syrian National Council itself. It's pretty mind-boggling, and it's very disheartening, because That makes you wonder what kind of democracy can produce. And Syria is not a good potential democracy producer, because the only two social indicators that seem to suggest when democracy might have a reasonable chance of producing are when you have a fairly adult population, 30% median age, 30 years old as a median age. Syria's median age is 21 years old. And a GDP that's over $6,000 per capita. That means that the average person in Syria should be making $6,000, $7,000 a year in order to give it more than 50% chance of making democracy. Syria's GDP was about $3,000 per capita GDP before the civil war started. Today, it's fallen dramatically because the Syrian pound has collapsed, there's no jobs, and it's going to get worse and worse because the international embargo, and the Syrians are going to get ground to the dust, and it's going to be very hard.
Explain then why it's so uncertain, this idea of what comes after Assad is so uncertain. James Jatras, as we look at the decision-making process currently underway in Washington, clearly that is one element of it. But what about this idea, though, that the US can divorce its strategic interest from humanitarian concern in its foreign policy? Does that seem credible anymore after the record that we've had?
I'd like to disagree on the premise of the question, but I don't think in many cases the United States follows our interests if you look at limited national interests as we normally define them.
What the prevailing wisdom is?
Well, I would say the policy objectives, which in the post-Cold War period have been highly ideological. There's a reason that Mr. Lavrov has said that there's much about American policy in the post-Cold War period that is reminiscent of Bolshevism and Trotskyism. We have this tendency to apply an ideological lens to complex problems and then decide them. Like, for example, this whole notion, well, really this question of democracy, this idea that you can draw a line down the middle of a country and say, these people are, quote, the Syrian people, and those people on the other side of the line, what are they, not the people? They're not human beings? We do this in other places as well. We did it in Ukraine, for example, during the Orange Revolution. Half the countries are the people, the other half are the non-people, I suppose. It's a very peculiar way to look at complex problems, especially in a country like Syria. But the other thing is look, on April 24th, I tweeted, watch for it. Just like we saw the Racak massacre in January 1999 in Kosovo, the breadline massacres in Bosnia, you make the assertion, you establish the fact of what happened, they committed a massacre. Who's going to go back and look again to see what actually really happened and how much maybe some of the people we've been pouring money and weapons on top of were responsible?
What makes it so confusing.
You create the premise where the humanitarian pressure becomes intolerable.
Right, but everything that we're hearing in Washington is they don't want to go in. So how does that then square?
I think there's some people who do want to go in. I think, look, there are lots of people who want to go in. There's certainly lots of people on Capitol Hill that are calling for us to go in, and I think there are people in the middle. I think the Secretary would like to go in. I think Susan Rice would like to go in. I think Samantha Power would like to go in. I don't know Barack Obama wants to.
Is it because of humanitarian concerns, or is it because of that proxy war against Iran?
I think it's both, but I would say that their idea of humanitarian concerns is, as I say, ideological in nature. It is, we have waved our magic moral wand and decided these people are, look, there's a civil war going on, but anybody killed by the government is a peaceful democratic demonstrator. How can that be?
Michele Dunne, what is your sense of the discussion here? It does get very complex. Does the US sincerely want to get rid of Assad, given he has in many ways been a force of stability for both US and Israeli interests in the region for so long, and no one really knows what will happen to afterwards?
Well, look, I feel as though we're operating on a false premise here, as though a stable Syria under Assad, admittedly repressive, but stable and reliable, is still an option. I don't think it's an option anymore.
But we have to remember, allies are repressive.
Not on this scale. We have to remember that, Syrians started a peaceful uprising, and then the government used a great deal of force about that, and it did transform into an armed rebellion, and now the government is using not only heavy weapons but militias going in, carrying out massacres of women and children as well as men on a fairly large scale.
But again, the U.S. has quite a high threshold for pain.
And the rebels are carrying out attacks on Christians too. We shouldn't care about that.
But historically, again, the historical record.
I really think. I'm not going to defend everything the Free Syrian Army does and so forth. But I really think if you look at it, and look at the Amnesty International report that just came out, the violence is hugely, disproportionately on the side of the government and government-directed militias in coordinated, systematic actions against the population. This is not a situation, and I don't think we created this situation.
No, but we're feeding.
We fostered this
of course
situation.
We're fostering it. If you don't think there are Western special forces on the ground and there aren't weapons going in from our allies, from the Turks, from the Saudis, from the Gulf states, we're all extremely naive around this table.
Joshua Landis, do you see a coherent strategy then that can be, where there are certain limits to the violence, in which case the US will go in, or is this entirely governed by strategic interest? Are there, frankly, does the concern about what, yeah, go ahead.
I think the strategic interests are major, and I do think that Washington does believe that the Assad regime is going to fall on its own, particularly if they give it a shove by putting weapons in there and giving intelligence and helping the opposition. They're starving the regime, feeding the opposition. That's going to change the balance of power. They see that there's 65% Sunni Arabs in Syria. There's 12% Alawites. Eventually, those 12% Alawites cannot rule anymore, especially if all of their allies fall away, their allies internally.
But does that mean that the US simply isn't interested in a peaceful negotiated resolution of this then?
They don't believe it's possible. And I think that they're probably right in the sense that Assad regime, if you get rid of Assad, and the whole regime is going to collapse. This regime is built around a family. It's built around personal relationships and traditional loyalties. There isn't a way, everybody's pretending that you could get some Alawite generals to take over, the Assads could go away.
The Yemeni solution.
Realistic.
Yeah, that's a non-starter.
It isn't realistic.
It's a non-starter.
It's not, this is like Saddam was saying, once you get rid of the top and the Assad family, the whole thing is going to crumble. There is an incredible groundswell in Syria to get rid of this regime. It's not everybody, and it's not even, 90% of the population. But it's a lot of people. They're getting arms. The world is mobilized around them. Their economic sanctions are devastating. This isn't going to turn around anytime soon. And the Assad regime is going to fall. And I think that's the U.S. calculation. And so the question of intervention becomes purely humanitarian question for Washington. It's not strategic, because strategically they know that Syria's toast and this regime is toast anyway. The question
but over what time frame are we talking? Help us, Joshua. I don't understand.
But I think they're very worried. They're anxious that the public outrage at the slaughter in Syria is going to force some kind of intervention that they do not want to get involved in, because then if they break Syria, they're going to end up owning it. And if this regime goes, the likelihood of violence going up and more killing rather than less killing is very high. Just like when you took down Saddam's regime, America killed over 10,000 people in the first month in Iraq to destroy Saddam's regime. When they left 8 years later, 120,000 people had been killed, and the killing is still going on at a tremendous rate.
James Jatras, isn't Russia making the same calculation, and aren't they making the same calculations that in the end there's an inevitability that, like Iraq, Syria will now split up into a proxy battle between geostrategic actors? It'll be a bloodbath. You better pick your side now.
No, I don't think there's a sense of inevitability. I think Joshua is right that let's say the betting man might say eventually this regime may not be able to hang on. I think on our side it becomes an ideological certainty, since that is already an accomplished fact, since we already know what the outcome is, what's the quickest way to get from A to B, especially the one that establishes that we're right and you, the Russians, are sickening. From Russia's point of view, I think they're saying, look, that may be the probability. It's not the necessary outcome. That we're committed, from the Russians' point of view, to keeping what we consider a friendly, legitimate, internationally recognized regime in power against a foreign-supported insurgency supported by a very substantial portion of the population. I mean, after all, it's a Sunni majority country, 60%. Not every Sunni. There are many secular Sunnis, including Mrs. Assad, who don't necessarily take the side of the insurgency. It's a true civil war, and I think that they would, I say with a high degree of legitimacy, certainly legal legitimacy, say that a legitimate government is not about to surrender power to a domestic insurgency supported from the outside illegally. I mean, this is aggression when you support an internal insurgency with arms and with other assistance, and that they will back that regime until at some point the insurgency fizzles out and they have to come to the negotiating table.
All right, so the only thing certain is the uncertainty of a future proxy war, really. James Jatras, thank you very much. Michele Dunne, thank you. Joshua Landis, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.